to classification and diagnosis. All right? So, if defining abnormality is so contentious, so difficult, why do we try to do it? One simple reason is that most sciences rely on classification, e.g. the periodic table in chemistry, the classification of living organisms into kingdoms, phyla, classes, and so on in biology. At the most fundamental level, classification systems provide us with a nomenclature. So let's get that there. Nomenclature, very important. Formalized naming system. Now, that's the nomenclature. Forgive me, like I said, my writing will get better, I promise, as I do this more often. So here's the thing about formalized naming, right? Your nomenclature. You want to be there's another term called jargon. Jargon is a part of nomenclature. Jargon refers to specific words used in an industry. A mechanic talking to other mechanic has a certain vocabulary that they would use after having enough experience to understand the industry. A psychologist would have certain phrases and words that are industry specific. This is jargon when it's released to the general public. One of the reasons why I'm upset that so many people know the term gaslighting right now is because it's overused and misapplied. But it is technically, in psychology, a term. Not just a term of art, it's an actual term. This gives clinicians and researchers both a common language and shorthand terms for complex clinical conditions. Without having a common set of terms to describe specific clinical conditions, clinicians would have to talk at length about each patient individually to provide an overview of the patient's problems. But if there's a shared understanding of what the term schizophrenia means, for example, communication across professional boundaries is simplified and facilitated. Perfect sense. Another advantage of the classification system is that it enables us to structure information in a more helpful manner. Classification systems shape the way information is organized. For example, most classification systems place diagnoses that are thought to be related in some way close together. In DSM-5, section on anxiety disorders includes disorders such as panic disorder, specific phobia, agoraphobia, and also generalized anxiety disorder that share common features of fear and anxiety. Because odds are, if depending on how you want to parse things out, you can be very close. For example, bipolar disorder. There's major depressive disorder. Well, you can't have major depressive disorder if you've ever had a hypomania or manic episode. You then might have persistent depressive disorder because of that particular criteria. So keeping them together helps you understand. Okay, it's this, but actually it's this. So it falls under a category, and you follow a branching path until you get to the closest possible diagnosis. And while no one is going to fit a diagnosis perfectly in general, they'll have 4 or 5 of the same traits, and then you can draw a reasonable conclusion, especially when you talk with the client. Keep in mind, I do want to mention something here. It's very important, is that I am depressed from time to time. That does not make me a depressed person. That makes me a person who suffers from depression. We have to remember to not essentialize diagnoses, because diagnoses are a part of us. They are not us. And previously, especially, I'm 34 right now. Previously, 1990s and below, they would be like, well, that's a autistic person. That's a depressed person. That's a schizophrenic person. It's a person with schizophrenia. It's a person who suffers from schizophrenia. There's more to that person than just their diagnosis or diagnoses. So just keep that in mind as we go forward. That's something to do, because while a lot of people may suffer from mental health issues, you want to make sure that you set yourself up for the highest degree of success in overcoming it. And while I'm not a therapist yet or a clinical psychologist yet, I am working on it. And so, practice makes perfect. Organizing information within a classification system allows us to study the different disorders that we classify and therefore learn new things. In other words, classification facilitates research, which gives us more information and facilitates greater understanding not only about what causes various disorders, but also how they might best be treated. For example, thinking about the cases you read about, Meek had alcohol and drug use disorders, and Scott has schizophrenia. Knowing what disorder each of them has is clearly very helpful because Scott's treatment would be very different from Monique's. Absolutely. Scott might get a treatment of SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, if you ever want to know what that is. And Monique may go through CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy. We may try to walk Monique through why do you feel the need to anesthetize yourself through life? And we may not phrase it like that, but that's ultimately what's happening. Well, why do you feel the need to drink? Is it just social? What are the positive benefits that you get from drinking? Well, maybe Monique is able to relax. We don't know. We talk to Monique and figure that out. A final effect of the classification system usage is somewhat more mundane. As others pointed out, the classification of mental disorders has a social and political implications. Simply put, defining the domain of what is considered to be pathological establishes the range of problems that mental health profession can address. As a consequence, on a purely pragmatic level, it furthermore delineates what type of psychological difficulties warrant insurance reimbursement and the extent of such reimbursement. When they said mundane, they meant it. Now, mundane comes from the word mundus, which means of the world. Normally, the world is a very awesome place. There's a lot of cool things that happen. But that's something we decided to put together and have fun with and all that. And I honestly, not a fan of that. Because ultimately people need healthcare. And even if people can't pay, they need healthcare. And even if people don't have insurance, people need healthcare. So, and it may not be for a long time, it may not be something, but people need it. So however, we exist in the reality we find ourselves, not the reality we wish we were in. So that's that. All right. So what are the disadvantages of classification? Of course, okay, I can, anyways. So there are obviously advantages of classification: facilitates research, ease of communication, standardized language. But, there are going to be some disadvantages too. So, of course, a number of potential disadvantages are associated with the use of a discrete classification system. Classification, by its very nature, provides information in a shorthand form. However, using any form of shorthand leads to a loss of information. So, for example, if I say that, X person is depressed. All right. Well, depression has certain connotations with it. But that doesn't specifically say what they're suffering. That there may be some type of extra information that's cut off by depression. Now, I sacrificed extreme accuracy for pragmatic communication and efficient communication. And that might be okay. If I would like to think that I'd use my professional judgment if it was something that was like, hey, you absolutely need to know that this person can't be around squirrels. They have a specific phobia to squirrels. And if you show them a squirrel, they are absolutely going to freak out. So I would like to think that I would be able to do that. If we know specific history, personality traits, idiosyncrasies, i.e. personality quirks, familiar relations with a person of a particular type of disorder, e.g. reading a case summary, we naturally have much more information than if we were simply told the individual's diagnosis, schizophrenia. In other words, as we simplify through classification, we inevitably lose an array of personal details about the actual person with the disorder. Moreover, although things are improving, there can still be some stigma. This is, again, stigma. Negative labeling, right? So, stigma. Negative labeling. So, what would be... So here's the thing. Has anybody in the chat experienced or had friends that might actually... That have a mental... Hey, what's going on, Jax? Welcome. That have friends that might have a mental health disorder that they don't really like to talk about because they'll mention like, oh, I get weird looks, people treat me differently. One of those things. In fact, when people find out that I have depression, sometimes they treat me a little differently. Sometimes I'm treated with kid gloves or talked in a calm, yet ultimately patronizing tone of voice. Has anyone else experienced this or seen it happen to a friend? I personally hate when that happens because I'm a person, I'm an adult, I'm capable. You don't have to treat me with kid gloves. So, disgrace associated with having a psychiatric diagnosis. Stigma, of course, is hardly the fault of the diagnostic system itself, but even today, people are generally far more comfortable disclosing they have a physical illness such as diabetes, rather than admitting to any mental disorder, which is weird because diabetes is generally caused by a lifestyle. You know, maybe you eat too much, maybe you don't work out, maybe you do stuff, but yet depression or anxiety or panic disorder or suicidal ideation or anything like that, it's not something you can control. You can't just be like, oh, I choose right now to not be depressed. Go. It doesn't work like that. But can choose to not consume sugary beverages or to not consume fattening foods in some cases. Now, of course, depending on your socioeconomic status, there may be certain things that are out of reach, but you can make an attempt. Broccoli's very cheap and not full of sugar. Now, but what if I can't get to it? Okay, well, again, you know, I'm talking in generalities, not in every specific case, because I know there are such things as food deserts. Food deserts, for those who don't know, are basically places where there's no fresh or healthy food. It's only packaged, processed foods, and fast food restaurants. Generally, high poverty urban areas tend to be food deserts. This is in part due to the fear, real or imagined, that speaking candidly about having a psychological disorder will result in unwanted social or occupational consequences or frank discrimination. Be honest, have you ever described anybody as nuts, crazy, or psycho? Now think of the hurt that people with mental disorders experience when they hear such words. In one study, 96% of patients with schizophrenia reported the stigma was a routine part of their lives. In spite of large amounts of information now available about mental health issues, the level of knowledge about mental illness, sometimes referred to as mental health literacy, is often very poor. So Jacko had said, when I asked my work partner if he got to sleep well, he tells me he spent the night crying on the bathroom floor. As generally unstable behavior, it's hard to know what to say. And Jacko, there's nothing wrong with not knowing what to say. I would, if you're, let me make a recommendation here as a layman. If you feel comfortable, talk to your work partner about it. Find out if they're doing okay. Let them vent if you're comfortable. If you're not comfortable, don't address it. Just realize, okay, sometimes my work partner cries because of some reason. But you know, there are things that was something there, because remember, it is nice to help people, but everybody has a different capacity and skills to help with. I cannot help you paint a painting. I might be able to help you streaming. I might be able to help you eventually with emotional, mental, psychological problems. Eventually, right now I can't because I'm not qualified. But I can help you with some engineering stuff. I can help with some general problem solving. But everybody has a capacity for that. So if you have the capacity and the inclination, maybe do it privately. Because nobody likes to put their stuff on Front Street. So it's a keep there. And when it mentions the level of knowledge about mental illness, sometimes referred to as mental health literacy, is often very poor. It's very true. It's very true. And depending on the industry you're in, it can be even worse. For example, the military. If it V just promotes people to encourage them. Well, that's good. I'm glad to hear that, V. I'm very glad to hear that. Welcome to the very first educational stream. If you have any questions or topics you want to talk about, we can. We'll lecture and read and give my take on it. But for now, we're going over some of the texts for abnormal psychology, and we've gone over a whole bunch of things. I will say, V, you did miss the part. Just in case, drowning children is generally considered abnormal, and we will not miss it. We don't do it. Illegal parking is abnormal, but nobody cares because it's a violation of the law. So there it is. Of course, for the stuff we have here, DSM-5 is the current version of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. DSM-4TR was the one before that. The International, let me give you, been lurking. Was there curiosity? Size of paper. I help zombie. Oh, dope. Oh, cool. Didn't. Oh, perfect. Just double checking there. Technically, he said the drowned children would not be missed. Evie Snare, of course. Well, Evie, keep me honest. Yes, because as I erased the drowned children labeling, I mentioned they would not be missed. Because that's a weird hyperbole. As Jacko had mentioned, it was an abnormal example. So, stigma is a deterrent to seeking treatment for mental health problems. This is especially true for younger people, for men, and for ethnic minorities. Stigma is also disproportionately greater deterrent to treatment for seeking two other groups: military personnel and, ironically, mental health professionals. Would you have predicted this, and why do you think this is the case? So, obviously, I can speak to the military. If anybody in your command finds out you are not mentally stable, you are immediately off the career track. You're non-recommended for promotion. You're off the career track. It takes so much to get back on the career track, and just a little bit of understanding, a little bit of counseling would be all right. And here's the crazy part: is after you get before holiday, right, or big holidays where people take blocks of leave, like a week or something, you go through safety briefing, and they talk about if you need to talk to somebody, go ahead and talk to somebody. But the thing is, if you talk to somebody, gets around command, and that person is now a weak link. That person is now a broke dick. That was an actual term used. Whereas if you gave them just a little bit of leeway to talk about maybe a little bit of depression, they can strengthen their coping mechanisms and be okay. I'm not gonna say get over it, but in the military term of getting over it. So that's something there. As for a mental health professional, well, if I would venture a guess, they're experts in the field. They obviously know what they're talking about. They know the symptoms. They know what's going on. It's so they might be reluctant to open themselves up, especially in a small community of, well, that person who helps people is also suffering from depression. How can they help me? When in reality, there's a lifetime prevalence, meaning of any point in a year, people alive, you could have 12% of depression. There's a lifetime prevalence of 12% of depression in Americans. So imagine that. So yeah, so more than 1 in 10 Americans suffer from depression. Now, related to stigma is the problem of stereotyping. Here we go. Okay, we're not writing all that. Stereotypes are automatic beliefs concerning other people that we unavoidably learn as a result of growing up in a particular culture, i.e. people who wear glasses are more intelligent, New Yorkers are rude. Because we have heard about certain behaviors that accompany mental disorders, we may automatically and incorrectly infer that these behaviors will also be present in any person we meet who has a psychiatric diagnosis. Negative stereotypes about psychiatric patients are also perpetuated in movies. If you've ever seen a horror movie, you know the common dominant theme involves a homicidal maniac. An analysis of 55 horror movies made between 2000 and 2012 has shown that people with psychosis are most often portrayed as murderers. Stereotyping also reflected in the comment, "People like you don't go back to work," in the case of James Mcnulty. So here's the thing. Let's think about this, right? Let's name some horror movies that have the negative stereotype. I'll start with one. So let's start. Let's see how many we can. Right? And it doesn't have to be for that time. Okay. So I'm going to start with one. Let's start with, obviously, let's go easy. Let's go. Psycho. Right? And, we'll give you another one. One that I was thinking about. It's actually a pretty good movie. O-R-E-H-A-N. Orphan. Okay. So what else do we got here for a couple more? We'll put a couple more there. For those who don't know, Psycho is one of the is a very classic movie, directed by, the hell was his name? Man, I can't remember. It's not George Orwell. Obviously not George. George Orwell was an author. Man, I can't remember his name. I can't remember the name because I know he did The Birds too. I can't remember the name. Oh well. And then of course, Orphan is a movie about a escaped mental patient who has a disease where she doesn't age, so she looks like a little girl, and she's like 35 and murders everybody and tries to seduce the father. So yeah, those are things there. If we can think of any other ones, we'll write them up on the board. I mean, I know a few more, like Audition. Yeah, put Audition on the board. Audition. Well, yeah, I don't care about that. All right. Anyways, so now in the case study of James Mcnulty. So he's lived with bipolar disorder for more than 35 years. All of his adult life, The first 15 years were relatively conventional, at least on the surface. He graduated from an Ivy League university, started his own business, and began a career in local politics. Already ready to go. He was married, the father of 2 sons, but he experienced mood swings during these years, and as he got older, the swings worsened, eventually became so ill he was unable to work, his marriage ended, lost his business, and he became homeless. That is a common story in America, is that everything's going great, you're working hard, and then you have the sudden onset of symptoms. And because our society is not designed to cope with mental illness, as soon as you run out of insurance, you are on the path to bankruptcy. And because you're dealing with mental illness, you may not be operating in the most rational framework. And since you're not operating in the most rational framework, you're eventually set up to fail. If you don't have an extremely strong support structure, that can be considered it's going to be a bad time for you. At this point, I had the most powerful experience with stigma. I was 38 years old. I had been recently discharged after a psychiatric hospitalization for a suicide attempt. I had no place to live. My savings were exhausted. My only possession was a 4-year-old car. I contacted the mental health authorities in the state where I then lived and asked for assistance in dealing with my mental illness. I was told that to qualify for assistance, I would need to sell my car and spend down the proceeds. I was asked how I was supposed to get to work when I recovered enough to find a job. I was told, don't worry about going back to work. People like you don't go back to work. That is a terrible, terrible idea. Listen, there might be some people who may not be able to work due to mental health. I am sure they are out there. I'm sure there's plenty of them. But when someone expresses a desire to return to what society considers normal, that should be encouraged, because that means they are an active and enthusiastic participant in their own treatment. And if you're an active and enthusiastic participant in your own treatment, you are going to be better at the treatment than just a passive observer. Consider this. Take a moment to honestly consider your own attitudes towards people with mental disorders. What assumptions do you make? Do you view people with mental illnesses as less competent, more irresponsible, more dangerous, and more unpredictable? Research has shown that attitudes are not uncommon. What movies, novels, or advertisements can you think of that maintain such stereotypes? What are some ways in which you challenge false assumptions that are so common in the media? Do you really think that reality shows such as Hoarders, Obsessed, My Strange Addiction have a helpful or harmful impact on societal attitudes? Now, I'm going to talk about those last 3, Hoarders, Obsessed, and My Strange Addiction. I think they absolutely are grotesqueries and should not exist. Because while you might be raising awareness of certain diseases, mental disease and mental disorders, you are absolutely profiting off the misery of people. I find that abhorrent. I think it's wrong. You know, and it would be different if the show was based on that person's journey through therapy, but that's not compelling TV. That is, first they go in and they show the grotesqueries of look at how the other person lives. You see all this stuff, and there's dramatic music and effects, and you get to see the person. Then they show the person having this, having this, conflict of, well, do I throw away the thing? And there is some therapist there, some psychologist who hasn't had really any time to work with this person, but they're there to provide a veneer of legitimacy. So yeah, I think that's the Hoarders formula. Then sometimes there's a success story and sometimes there's not. Just enough success stories to give you that feel-good, suffering porn catharsis. So yeah, I don't like those. I think they are harmful and grotesque. Finally, stigma can be perpetuated by labeling. So again, this is where labeling, let's talk about labeling. So go down here, we'll just put that up there. Now, labeling. So assigning a person to a particular diagnostic category such as schizophrenia. We mentioned that earlier. We mentioned the problem of labeling as how, people are, I'm a depressed person. That's a schizophrenic person. That's an autistic person. No, it is a person who has depression, because that diagnosis is not your entire being. A person's self-concept may be directly affected by being given a diagnosis of schizophrenia, depression, or some other form of mental illness. How might you react if you were told something like this? Furthermore, once a group of symptoms is given a name and identified by means of diagnosis, this diagnostic label can be hard to shake even if the person later makes a full recovery. And believe me, people do make recovery. You can relapse, of course, but people will make recovery. Depression is in general, at least in myself, is not a continual state. Now, some people do have almost continual states of depression or anxiety. Generalized anxiety disorder is a thing. Persistent depression disorder is a thing. Major depressive disorder is a thing. So keep that in mind. It is important to keep in mind, however, that diagnostic classification systems do not classify people. They classify the disorders that people have, and the stigma may be less a consequence of the diagnostic label than the result of disturbed behavior that got the person the diagnosis in the first place. In some situations, the diagnosis may even reduce the stigma because it provides at least a partial explanation for a person's otherwise inexplicable behavior. Nonetheless, when we note that someone has an illness, we should take care not to define him or her by that illness. Respectful and appropriate language should be used instead. At one time, it was quite common for mental health professionals to describe a patient as a schizophrenic or a manic depressive. Now, it's widely acknowledged that it's more accurate, not to mention more considerate, to use what is called person-first language. Say a person with schizophrenia, a person with bipolar disorder. Simply put, person, not the diagnosis. So, how can we reduce prejudice towards those people who are mentally ill? Keep in mind, before we continue, if anybody has any other questions they want to ask, we can do that. I just know that right now I'm going through here with I'm going through with all of the abnormal psychology, because one, it's what interests me. Two, I think it might help everyone else, and yeah, we'll just go with that. So, negative reactions to people. Love, could you talk a little less? Thank you. I appreciate it. Just, negative reactions to people with mental illnesses are common and may be fairly widespread phenomenon throughout the world. Using focus groups, Arthur and colleagues asked community residents in Jamaica about the concept of stigma. Some participants came from rural communities, say that, I promise, and others from more urban areas. Regardless of their gender, level of education, or where they lived, most participants described highly prejudicial attitudes towards those with mental illness. One middle-class male participant said, "We treat them as second-class, in a sense, as second-class citizens. We stay far away from them, ostracize them, we treat them bad." Fear of people who are mentally ill was also commonly expressed. A rural-dwelling middle-class man described a specific situation in the following way. "There's a mad lady on the road named blank. Even the police are afraid of her because she throws stones at them. She's very, very terrible. Moreover, when kindly attitudes were expressed, fear was still a common response. One person put it simply, you are fearful even though you may be sympathetic." In short, the results of the study suggest that stereotyping, labeling, and stigma towards people with mental illnesses are not restricted to industrialized countries, although we might wish it were otherwise. Prejudicial attitudes are common. This highlights the need for anti-stigma campaigns. Basically, in this sense, we can all do better. We can all understand that mental health in general is not contagious. Now, there is such a thing as vicarious conditioning. We can get into that later. But that doesn't treat... If you stigmatize treatment, less people are going to get treatment. If your goal is to minimize suffering via mental health, you would also want to minimize stigma. For a long time, it was thought that educating people that mental illnesses were real brain disorders might be the solution. Sadly, however, this did not seem to be the case. Although there have been impressive increases in the proportion of people who now understand that mental disorders have neurobiological causes, meaning brain, physical, this increased awareness has not resulted in decreases in stigma. In one study, Pescasolido and colleagues asked people in the community to read a vignette, brief description, about a person who showed symptoms of mental illness. Some people read a vignette about a person who had schizophrenia. Others read a vignette about some people who had clinical depression or alcohol dependence. Importantly, no diagnostic labels were used to describe these people. These vignettes simply provided descriptive information. Nonetheless, the majority of people who were surveyed in this study expressed an unwillingness to work with the person described in the vignette. They also did not want to have to socialize with them and did not want them to marry into their family. Moreover, the level of rejection was shown just as high as in a similar survey that was done 10 years earlier. Over that same 10-year period, however, many more people embraced a neurobiological understanding about the causes of mental illness. So what this study tells us is that just because people understand that a mental illness is caused by problems in the brain doesn't mean they're any less prejudiced towards those with mental illness. This is a disappointing conclusion for everyone who hoped the more scientific research into biology of mental illness would lead to the elimination of stigma. And I'm not gonna lie, it is a little disappointing. What I think that in this case, it is an empathy gap. So these people are reading about person X with diagnosis, or with XYZ, or with a YZ double alpha condition, right? Unless they can tie that to someone in their life, a lot of people have this NIMBY, not in my backyard mentality. You know, they don't want it near me. It's fine if it exists. I'm not saying lock it up, throw away the key, but not in my backyard. Now, when it's somebody in their family already, somebody they love, that empathy can if it's pointed out, that can blossom into something that, oh, well, of course, we need this. We saw this a lot recently with Republican politicians in American politics, where, for example, Rush Limbaugh, before he passed, was a huge drug addict. And I don't mean just because he was big and fat. I mean, like, he was a huge, like, rap song level of pills being taken. And he was for drug treatment program. Dick Cheney, neocon through and through, was for marriage equality because one of his daughters happens to be a lesbian. So this empathy gap of, oh, well, it happened to me, it happened to my family, I guess I should develop some feelings about that, happens to a lot of people. No one's immune from that happening. From that happening. I'm included in that. So keep that in mind as we go from there. Now, stigma does seem to be reduced by having more contact with people in the stigmatized group. However, there may be barriers to this. Simply imagining interacting with a person who has a mental disorder can lead to distress and to also unpleasant physical reactions. In an interesting study, Graves and colleagues asked college students enrolled in the psychology course to imagine interacting with a person whose image has been shown to them on a slide. As the slide was being presented, subjects were given some scripted biographical information that described the person. In some scripts, the target of the person was described as having been diagnosed with schizophrenia, although it was mentioned that he or she was doing much better now. So, diagnosis, but they're not currently suffering from it. So keep that in mind. In other trials, the biographical description made no mention of any mental illness when the person was on the slide being described. Students who took part in the study reported more distress and had more muscle tension in their brows when imagining interacting with a person with schizophrenia than when they imagined interacting with a person who did not have schizophrenia. Heart rates changed also suggests they were experiencing the imagined interactions with the patients as being more unpleasant than interactions with non-patients. Finally, research participants who had more psychophysiological reactivity to the slides of the patients reported higher levels of stigma towards those patients. The findings suggest that people may tend to avoid those with mental illness because the psychophysiological arousal these encounters can create is experienced as unpleasant. So, let's think about it this way. Why could that be, right? There is a human trend in some cases to imagine the worst case scenario. So they're not imagining the person who's like, oh, you know, I'm better. It's, oh no, when they talk with me, they're going to have a break with reality, or they're going to have an episode, or they're going to be manic depressed, or they're going to be raving stark lunatics, or they're going to be catatonic. Probably very, I would say it's probably very upsetting to talk with somebody who's catatonic, because it's really a one-sided conversation. So keep that in mind. And then, of course, the people who, as a control, who didn't have they weren't given a biographical information of mental disorders, showed normal expression. So, something there.